If you've been following our coverage of the Manning Conference, the name you'll no doubt be familiar with is that of the founder of the Manning Centre and also a tremendously influential figure in Canadian politics, Preston Manning, who joins me now. Preston, thank you for having us here, and thank you for being with me today.
Thank you, yeah.
So let's talk about one of the big themes that's come up throughout your remarks and that of a lot of the speakers at the conference this year, and that has been about looking at the Conservative movement as almost a separate entity from the Conservative Party. And I think that's so tremendously valuable. And one of the things that I've really admired about you and the Manning Centre for several years. But for people that aren't as familiar with the concept, that view conservatism as synonymous with the Conservative Party of Canada, how important is that, and how do you really define what you've tried to approach?
Well, I think it is important, and I use a sort of a triangle model to try to explain it. I say that at the tip of the triangle is the conservative political parties. They're the retail end of conservatism that goes out and fights elections. In fact, increasingly, the modern political party, that's virtually all it does. It fights elections and it gets ready for the next election. But beneath that top of the pyramid, there's a whole bunch of other institutions, the think tanks that develop intellectual capital, the advocacy groups that promote it, the communicators, the mentors and trainers that train people to provide training for political action, the donors, the philanthropists, the people that there's that huge amount underneath that develop the intellectual capital, the human capital, the financial capital that the parties need to succeed. So they're connected. But and our Manning Centre is more involved in trying to develop or coordinate, to be a better word, coordinate the activities of the movement as distinct for the parties, so that at the end of the day the parties can be more successful.
How much of a challenge is it to make sure that conservative values with a small c remain at the center of what conservative parties across the country are standing up for?
Well, I think it's a challenge that has to be constantly addressed. Conservatives, more than, say, liberals or social democrats, tend to be in silos. The conservative provincial parties don't do much together. There's a distant relationship with the federal party. The conservative think tanks don't do a lot collectively. There's a fear of losing donors if you do too much collectively. And so one of our big function, and our bigger function going forward, is just networking. Try to rub these components of the movement together better. And I think the more you do that, the more you get a consistent message and a consistent adherence to principles. When people are in silos, it's easy to get, kind of distracted one way or the other.
Going back to, let's say, Pierre Trudeau, the Trudeau the Seniors era, and you have the trajectory of Canadian politics since then, the creation of the Reform Party, the evolution to the Alliance, uniting to become the Conservative Party of Canada. Do you see the movement now as in a better place than it was 30, 40, 50 years ago?
I think so. I think that there are far more conservative think tanks. There are far more advocacy vehicles. With the advent of the social media, there is more communications capacity. I see that vastly expanding. Now, of course, while it's expanded on the conservative side, the movements behind liberalism, social democratic positions has expanded too. So, but I see a great change from those days.
But at the same time, we also have to look at some of these institutional changes, and I think that when it comes to bringing the Conservative Representative Party at the federal level to become more conservative, you were necessary for that, as we saw. Now we have a dynamic in Canadian politics that some have tried to compare to that. Maxime Bernier splitting off to found the People's Party of Canada. And are the circumstances of this split of the right, or attempted split of the right, different than when you did it? And if so, how?
Well, no, I think they're part of a pattern, but a different pattern than the one you're referring to. What Maxime has done has been done at least 4 times before, always in Quebec. In the years during the Second World War, there was a Bloc Populaire, was created in Quebec. A Liberal MP disagreed with what his party was doing on conscription, went and formed a new party. Campaigned in the election, won 3 or 4 seats, didn't change anything much, but it made that a bigger issue. In the social credit days, there was the Ralliement de Créditistes, Riel Couette, lost the leadership bid for the Social Credit Party, went and started a new party in Quebec. The Ralliement des Créditistes got 14 seats, got a few seats, actually took votes from the Liberals, in fact denied the Liberals, that's why Pearson never got a majority. And then of course you had Lucien Bouchard, broke with Brian Mulroney, a guy from Quebec, disagreed with where they were going, created a party that created a huge disruption. And now I see what Maxime's doing is in that tradition. And it can have an effect, it can clarify a particular issue. 3 out of the 4 of these were basically unsuccessful attempts. They didn't have much of an impact other than a blip on the radar screen. So I would say what's being done there is sort of fundamentally different than what Reform did.
So you don't see this as the beginning of a Reform 2.0 by any stretch?
No,
then?
I see it more as in that pattern of Quebec politicians who disagree with a result of a national thing and go and form a new party as a result.
Well, that actually brings up an important question in that Quebec has always been a weak spot for Conservatives. I know Stephen Harper had some marginal success there in one of his elections, but even then it got wiped away as quickly as it was there. Do you think that's going to be a permanent reality, or do you think it's possible to have a national federal Conservative Party that can have success in Quebec?
Well, I think one of the dangers for Quebec, if I was thinking as a Quebecer, not as someone from the West, is that in the future, in the 21st century, it will be possible to form a national government without winning a single seat in Quebec. And I worry about that. And some people may say, well, you're probably glad of that because you're from, but no, I'm not. The reason I'm not glad is that I remember when the West was exactly in that position. You could form a national government without getting a single seat west of the Manitoba-Ontario border, and it's not a good position to be in. It's a weak position to be in. And I think what that reality means for Quebecers is it'll be more important in the future for Quebec to have allies outside Quebec to compensate for that position. And I would say to them, the place you'll find those allies is in the West, because both of us want a more decentralized federation, and we remember what it was like when you couldn't influence the national government.
Yeah, and one area where I think there is a possible coalition between Quebec voters and national Conservative voters is on immigration issues. Now, I mean, the things you see in Quebec in the immigration discourse, no non-Quebec politician could get away with saying it in some respects, but I think that we've now brought, I think in this election cycle, immigration is going to be front and center. I know it's been a topic of discussion this weekend in which I've played a role on the panel, but do you think that is going to be a winning coalition?
Well, I think that could be an issue on which people could get together. I think one of the assets that Andrew Scheer brings, and I don't know how one would communicate this in a campaign, because it's an asset that comes about because of what he is not because of what he is. Andrew's the only leader I know of, and even historically, that was Speaker for a considerable period of time before he became leader. Usually the Speaker is some older guy that they couldn't put in the cabinet.
The person that has no real partisan ambitions
well, they couldn't put in the cabinet, so they could be Speaker. But he was a young guy, and he was Speaker. And of course, the Speaker has to be more ecumenical. The Speaker has to work with everybody else. And I think Andrew is not a polarizer.
No.
He is not a polarizer. And more people are getting worried. A lot of the discussions today is that there's politics that everybody gets in their separate camp. And people worry about, if you're really worried about polarization, Andrew brings that quality of not being a polarizer. He's actually a consensus builder. And I think that could be a very strong point in his favor when coming to this as a federal election campaign.
What is the point, if such a thing even exists, where you'll be able to say, I've done my work, I'm finished, I'm out, I'm retired? And it's not about you personally, but even the Manning Center itself, or do you think there's always going to be some battle for the Conservative movement to embrace?
Well, yeah, there's the battle end of it, but I think this integrating and networking and communicating is just an ongoing, if Conservatism is sort of a living organism, this networking and communicating, that has to go on forever and forever and forever.
And the left learned that very soon and very quickly before Conservatives did, I'd say.
Yes, and if you have a collectivist mentality, for
that's
example, it makes
how do you herd individualists, right? That's the Conservative dilemma.
The NDP in this last provincial election in Ontario, there were Labour organizers from Halifax to Vancouver spending time in the Ontario election. Conservatives don't do that. So whether it's done under the Manning center foundation or not is not the real question. The conservatism needs this network and this constant network and communication to be more effective, and somebody has to do it. We're doing it now.
So where do you see, as far as the state of conservatism goes, what's something that you didn't really have to deal with back in the 80s that wasn't really a fight for conservatives, but now is, that you think people need to embrace?
I think, two things. One is this whole use of the social media and how it relates to politics. It was just coming in at the time I was involved. Now it's a huge thing. But the other huge thing, and I think this is on the international sphere, I think the big ideological contest of the 21st century is going to be citizen-directed democracy versus state-directed governance as practiced by and promoted by the Communist Party and government of China, and market-driven capitalism versus state-directed capitalism as practiced by the Communist Party and government of China. I think that's the huge ideological battle of the future, and conservatives ought to be and are, not just conservatives, on the side of citizen-directed democracy, but it'll be conservatives that will champion market-driven capitalism as opposed to state capitalism. And I think that's a huge challenge for the next generation.
When you say citizen-driven, are you describing populism or something distinct from populism?
Well, I would include populism. No, but I'm talking about something different than that. The communist version is that the state ultimately is the best one to guard the governance system, that the authority and the legitimacy of the political system comes from on high, in their case from a dictatorship. The Western view, it's not confined to Canada, is that ultimately it comes from the bottom. I've been a fan of Jefferson's, and one of the things he wrote towards the end of his life, and in a way, if there ever was an elite, legitimate member of an elite, it was Jefferson.
Yes.
But he said, I can think of no safer depository for the ultimate powers of society than in the people themselves. And then anticipating the objection, but the people, they don't know anything, they're ignorant, they'll go chasing after somebody. He said, and if you think them not fit to exercise self-government with a wholesome discretion, the remedy is not to take it from them, but to inform their discretion. That's a pretty good definition of the democratic challenge, and I think it's one that's a constant challenge in every generation.
In the United States, we saw a fairly significant schism form, I think, in the American right because of Donald Trump, and a lot of divides, not just on him personally, but on policy. You've got very protectionist conservatives, you've got free trade conservatives, you've got social and fiscal conservatives that don't get along, you have libertarians and others as well. And I'm guessing, to end on, a good point would be, are you optimistic that conservatism itself will be able to hold in Canada, or in the West more broadly, as a big tent?
Yes, I think if it gets the leadership it requires that attaches a high priority to that coordination of the different components of the movement. I think it also depends on whether conservatives are willing to engage in constructive discourse. You're always going to have these differences, and it's legitimate.
And they're not new differences
No, and
either.
it's legitimate to have them. It's just the manner in which the discourse is conducted, though. If I insult you and punch you on my way out of the room here, that's not conducive. If we have a disagreement and I respect you, but I disagree with you, and you respect me and I disagree, then I think you can hold the things together. And then somebody told me the definition of a Canadian optimist, and I'm an optimist, is someone who thinks things could be worse.
There we go. Well, we'll keep the cameras rolling just in case you do throw a punch, but I think that's a great way of doing things. Preston Manning, I've been a big fan of the work you've done and your legacy at the conference and also in Canadian politics, so thank you very much for your time.
Well, thank you.
Preston Manning.